There's no regulation mandating that bourbon need to be produced in Kentucky, even though it would possibly seem that manner given the kingdom's dominance in distilling the different corn primarily based, barrel elderly whiskey. According to the Kentucky Distillers Association, the Bluegrass State produces and a while about 95% of the arena's bourbon whiskey. So is there something in Kentucky's water that has brought about the bourbon enterprise to flourish? In reality, there is. The nation sits atop full-size deposits of blue limestone, which filters out tough iron and imparts sweet-tasting calcium and magnesium. At the moment you may visit an open stream in Kentucky, and it will taste higher than 90% of tap water inside the United States due to the fact the limestone filters out undesirable minerals, says whiskey historian Fred Minnick, writer of Whiskey Women and Bourbon Curious, a simple tasting guide for the savvy drinker. Kentucky's wide temperature swings, from chilly winters to hot summers, are also conducive to generating bourbon due to the fact they purpose the charred all-right barrels, which give the spirit its amber shade and different taste, to alternately take in and launch the whiskey. We have the perfect weather to age bourbon in all likelihood, says Wild Turkey Grasp distiller Jimmy Russell, a member of the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame who grew up less than 5 miles from the distillery where he has labored when you consider that 1954. You need the hot summers and bloodless winters in order that the timber can breathe and the whiskey can circulate inside and outside of it. Another element that makes Kentucky fertile floor for bourbon production is literally its fertile ground. The influx of settlers who crossed the Appalachian Mountains within the past 1700s quickly learned the Kentucky soil was ideal for developing bourbon's second major component, corn. Drawn in component by means of Virginia's 1776 Corn Patch and Cabin Rights Act, which supplied 400 acres to any settlers who constructed cabins and planted corn in its then territory of Kentucky, immigrants from Germany, Scotland and the north of Ireland had been amongst folks who arrived with the whiskey distilling know-how from their homelands in tow. The ease of growing corn in Kentucky brought on distillers who migrated from the East Coast to exchange their whiskey recipes. Rye turned into the plentiful grain in Pennsylvania and Maryland, Russell says, but whilst distillers came over the Appalachians they observed corn the dominant grain so that they used corn rather than rye. By the 1780s a distinctive fashion of corn-based totally whiskey turned into being distilled in Kentucky, despite the fact that Minnick says the tale that Baptist minister Elijah Craig invented bourbon through accident after storing his whiskey in barrels charred by way of a fire is mere legend concocted by means of whiskey advocates to cloak the spirit inside the non-secular. Craig became a totally effective and essential character, however we don't have any credible records to suggest that he would have been a true inventor of bourbon, Minnick says. Whiskey elevated in recognition after the American Revolution as the import of rum, which had been the most famous alcoholic drink in lots of American colonies, slowed with decline of the Triangle Exchange with Great Britain. The lingering debt from the warfare, but, induced the federal government to levy a tax on liquor in 1791. Distillers in Maryland and Pennsylvania, in particular, bristled on the tax and led the Whiskey Rebellion, which was ultimately quelled through thousands of federal troops dispatched through President George Washington in 1794. Minnick notes, but, that the Whiskey Rebellion did no longer spark a mass migration of tax-dodging distillers to Kentucky and that an estimated 500 distilleries had been already running inside the country on the time. However, he notes that to save you a comparable famous uprising Congress left whiskey largely tax unfastened till the Civil War, except in short to pay for the War of 1812. After the Whiskey Rebellion, Congress decided now not to tax whiskey, however they introduced price lists onto rum because there was a concept that money from rum would emerge as getting into the arms of the British. The high levies on rum and its key factor, molasses, contributed to hovering whiskey consumption within the early many years of the Republic. Kentucky's whiskey industry, in particular, thrived as slave hard work assisted with production and distillers took benefit of the kingdom's plethora of navigable waterways, including the Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and Mississippi rivers, that provided easy get-right of entry to large cities together with Cincinnati and New Orleans. In addition to Kentucky's geographic benefits, Minnick says the nation's sturdy families who handed distilling down from technology to generation and sustained their groups in bad monetary times additionally allowed the bourbon industry to flourish. Many fundamental regions had tremendous distilling capacity, However, the more potent households had been here in Kentucky, and that sustained bourbon through the years. All the historic owned family names that you see on these antique bourbon bottles have been passionate. They developed a following, and for the maximum part these companies had been capable of paintings collectively for the commonplace excellent. Although the time period bourbon started to appear in newspaper advertisements for Kentucky's particular brand of whiskey with the aid of the 1820s, its origins are murky. Some historians agree with the moniker changed into inspired by means of Kentucky's Bourbon County, itself named after the French royal-owned family and reputation of France's aid within the American Revolution. Bourbon County initially occupied a large section of significant Kentucky, and neighborhood distillers stamped its call as the county of starting place on whiskey barrels transported across the U.S. Minix says some other idea is the call derived from Bourbon Street in New Orleans, in which the drink changed into popular inside the French Quarter saloons. There's not enough precise proof one way or another, he says. There's one fact approximately bourbon, even though, that couldn't be disputed consistent with Russell. You could make bourbon wherever within the country, he says, however if it's no longer Kentucky bourbon, it's now not bourbon.